are running the show. Away we go. Cue light bulb and clickety clacks. Welcome to Evolution Hour on the 5th of May, 2025, in our years of doom. And don't forget, tortuganwordpress.com, whole bunch of stuff there, freebies, etc., so on and so forth. Well, a little bit tad late today because my PDF reader went berserk, and I was trying to resolve a thing about the title of a new paper. There's a whole bunch of really delightful new papers. I check Science, PNAS, and Nature every week, in addition to all the other stuff that comes in from all of our little threads of connecting people that I know, and a lot of which involves updates for Rocks for their Volume 2, including some neat little stuff on the Green Sahara, population dynamics, and who settled Malta when, and bits about random form that generate the components of the Krebs cycle. So it's just really a delightful amount of little stuff that's getting folded into the new book. Anywho, as you know, we are going through the grisly task, source by source, item by item, The Creationist Titans book by Sarfati and Tay. And we are now concluding chapter 11, where they finally finished the last of their material on coprolites and that. There's not a huge amount of technical work on that subject. In here, they've got a 2006 paper on possibly venomous Mesozoic mammals, which the paper actually relates to basal monotremes. So that's actually something that makes perfect sense in terms of an evolutionary framework, but they're just going, gee whiz, wow, baby mammals might have started out venomous. So work that did not generate any contribution to, they're simply latching onto as a peripheral. Then there's a 2012 paper from Hone et al. Alas, I do not have the whole paper for you, but I will be putting a link up to the extended abstract info that Science Direct has, which gives a lot of the basic information on it. On dinosaurs eating pterosaurs, like duh. Doesn't seem unreasonable if you have relatively small pterosaurs. And by the way, we are talking relatively small pterosaurs. Some pterosaurs are very small, crow-sized. Others are monstrous things like the Quetzalcoatlus and all that crowd that occurred later on. Again, there's an evolutionary framework, as not all of these things are appearing at the same time. There's a sequence of events that we can see that no creationist has attempted to make sense of within the dynamics of the flood context. And then the most galling one was a 2019 paper from Sulej and Niedzwiecki, who they had alluded to earlier in the book, but I'm going to be putting the link directly to it up again here because they're bringing it up, which relates to a large synapsid living in the time of the dinosaurs. And the trope that Sarfati and Tay have been playing is that supposedly it was considered amazing and unsettling because all the little synapsids in mammals were very small, and that therefore the existence of a large one would be, horrors. And not really. You simply go, oh gosh, we see that the synapsids could get pretty big, even in the dinosaur period. And so this one, size elephant, fine and dandy. The fact that the synapsids are a catastrophic problem for the whole creationist paradigm, including the intelligent designers, as I wrote a whole book explaining why. Yipes. Why does he think to bring this stuff up? Part 2 is a cute little thingy from Brian Thomas from last year on the Gunnison aspens. There's a whole series that Thomas does in Acts and Facts on various national forests and national monuments and stuff. Presumably people can visit. So I don't know, maybe they're thinking that it's kind of like a patriotic bit. But at any rate, they've been kind of plowing through a variety of ones. And this one connects up with the whole Grand Canyon formation and the Morrison formation and all that big slop along in there. And here they're just bringing up these trees there, the aspens. The Gunnison aspens, particular variety there. And they cite some old work from 2007 by Bervelier on bark photosynthesis. And when it's actually about more what's going on in the stems. So there's, background evolutionary information here that's connecting up that they're not, Thomas isn't alluding to. And then you can compare that with a paper I'll be putting a link up to from 2024 on the dynamics of how trees operate on that thing. So we can get you pair Brian Thomas's version and how superficial it is versus the follow-up that was engendered by the very paper he was citing. And that shows you what 17 years can do in the sciences as opposed to zip going on in the creationist context. The only recent technical paper that shows up in Thomas is one from 2022 by Gerson on the plasticity in their germination systems. And that one actually is in relation to global warming issues, which is a topic that most creationists, being Kulturkämpfers, do not like at all. Left in the dust on all that is the paleogeographical origins of the bloody genus. So the North American forms are appearing about 58 million years ago, and there are Chinese fossils that go back all the way to the Cretaceous. And I'll be putting a link into a paper episodes of spreading, and that it's tracked in part by. So there's a whole of evolutionary background on those topics that they're writing a really extensive piece. All they're doing, the creationists, are just pot-shotting references to things and not diving typically into papers. Oh, hi, Purple. Greetings, sentient beings. The Thomas is not particularly diving into material that is going to lead the reader easily into troublesome areas. So phylogenetics, detailed systematics, detailed biogeography, and all of that are typically not the primary topics of the various papers that get listed in these gee whiz style pieces that Thomas reflects. It doesn't mean the material isn't there, and it doesn't mean that buried down in the papers past that things in like the discussion section. One of the things that's kind of a common thread that you find out, the creationists are terrible at getting past the abstract, so that it sounds like in many respects the creationists don't really pay much attention to the discussion section. Danstra and Cardinale and others, when they'll bring up how science papers are done, Gutsick Gibbon is in the same mode. She'll bring this up. Erica, dear sweet Erica, is that you have the abstract up at the top that gives a good summary. Perfectly fine here is this bit from the Liu paper. And you got their big title, and then you get an abstract that describes what's going on, which are the high points. But high points ain't the whole bloody paper. And so typically, you have to dive down pages to arrive at like the and run into quite a few pages in all our technical papers, where they're going into considerable detail in explaining the context and the basic conclusions that they're doing. And if you dive into that section, it can often be worse than an awful lot of the segments that you find elsewhere in section and in the things where they're going into the technical descriptions of stuff. So the standard rule of thumb then is, are you crushing on Erica? Oh, do you think she's the gorilla of your dreams? Oh, you... Well, first of all, Erica is already taken. And secondly, spoiler alert, I swing in a different direction. So not that, but nonetheless, I admire her enormously, both for the meticulousness of her presentations, but her affability. I don't think none of us can hold a candle to Erica for her ability to just positively fillet a creationist in such a way that it's not coming across as nasty. I'm a prickly old man and so forth and so on. I even lost my temper. There have been one creationists that rubbed me the wrong way that I've actually gone ballistic on because I'm bumping into the stuff. But Erica is far too affable on this thing. So I think she's an absolutely spectacular communicator in this area. And someone else I'll mention as a spectacular communicator, Zach Hancock, the geneticist. She's very smart, delivers her information very well. Exactly so. Zach Hancock, who has been doing a really neat series on his channel, not as frequently as Erica or others may post, but they're well worth it because he will be going into really high level things on genetics. One just did recently natural selection in the random, and what exactly does that mean? And it's actually much more intricate than the mutations or random natural selection isn't trope. That there are cyclings and things that can go on in populations depending upon the nature of the alleles and that. And it's really weeds material, but it means that nature is operating in a much more complicated way. And it's also stuff that when you get down to the end, they're using so many mathematical analysis to make it absolutely rigorous that, boy, they can get really technical in there. And that's and accurate. And that's one of the reasons why Zach and Dan Stern Cardinale have such a low opinion of the various creationist geneticists, because they're just miles away from the actual technical material. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Zach Hancock, he's published geneticist and got tattoos and all this kind of stuff. He's a very affable fellow. Does the typical video that he does is about a half hour long. You can Google him on his YouTube stuff. I think it's Dr. Zach Hancock is the channel tag on there. And by all means, subscribe to it, because I, for one thing that really need, because as a history geek, coming at the sciences from a sidebar, I am not up on all the ins and outs, not merely of what all the current scientific thinking is on a particular detailed topic. And this was the example that I just gave about is natural selection and mutations random or not, is an area that, wow, it was just like a revelation, because he's going into the deep roots of papers that are first appearing in like the 1920s from some of the big heavy guns in the area that were starting to tiptoe into the area of how you measure variation and how variation plays out inside of a phenotype and in a population, and building up towards material that's much more recent. And then applied cases, his particular area that he had studied is this stupid little Daphnia, little arthropody wiggly thing, that's you want to get out the raid and get rid of them if you saw them anywhere as little infestations of crap. But it turns out they were extremely interesting, because one of the elements is that you can have two populations of effectively the same species that have really different genotypes to the point where they're separate groups, this cryptic species issue. And all of that ultimately is diving back upon how mutations can be differentially selected for, even though the net effect seems to be like zero. You got to watch his video. He explains all the material. And so I was making a point of downloading some of the technical papers, particularly the older ones. He had links for a lot of the primary material that he was dealing with. The various older ones that were popping up as just screenshots are all ones that you can Google, because I downloaded them. I found them on various websites, no problem. So I made a point of adding that into the field. Some of it involves Fisher and JBS Haldane and some of these other ones that are there's absolutely delicious. So there's a historical context of stuff that only somebody who teaches at that collegiate level and also writes technical papers at that level can really get a grip on. And so I strongly recommend Zach Hancock. So you got Zach Hancock in geology, and then you got Nick Zentner in geology. Did I say Zach Hancock in geology? No, that's right. Not right. But Nick Zentner's material, because he teaches at Central Washington University, which is next door to where I live. I'm in Spokane, and he operates out of Ellensburg, flat smack dab in the middle of the state. His lectures, college level material, and the summer shows that he does exploring various details. He knows all the big figures in the geology movement, to where you're able to talk on a first name basis to explain abstruse issues about the cutting edge of the geological field and all that. And they're absolutely spectacular. I think I haven't yet encountered quite that same doorway opener in some of these other technical fields. Now, if I'm looking at things on to keep track of primate evolution, Erica, perfectly fine material on that. That gives me my doorway into it. Knee deep in the cosmology chapter, solar system formation and all that stuff for the new book. And although there are lots and lots of video postings and things on it, I haven't yet encountered kind of like the golden door in this area. And if somebody have some people to recommend in there, I'd be absolutely delighted. Yep. Oh, yes. That's one of the ways that you can keep abreast of things by knowing people who are reliable. And one of the ways that I can further measure how reliable they are is A, they're putting sources up so you can follow. And B, oh, James, yes, fire a question. Put one in. I may or may not have a good answer to it. And no such things as bad questions, only adequate or inadequate answers. Although questions can have axes to grind behind them, that can often be the case. But fire away, Peru. And we are waiting. Tick, 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 tick. Bum, 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 bum. Come on, Peru. Type your thing in. You only got a limited character size, so it can't be a novel. Anyway, let me take a swig of things while I'm waiting for this. Oh, that's Vesta. Plantis Weekend Reason Conference at Forrest Falkai. Oh, yeah, Forrest is another very, very sharp speaker. And he, in fact, he and Erica have done call-in shows. There's an interesting mix of people that bounce back and forth on all the subject. They're, of course, way younger than I am. I'm an old fart. Who is the president of India? Modi, I think his name is currently. And he's kind of a Hindu nationalist. We'll be alluding to him kind of in the side in Rocks for Their Volume 2, because you've got groups of people. The same thing is going on with Erdogan in Turkey, with the Islamic nationalism in there, and that bumps into a lot of how they want us. They have how they want history to run, and they will want to tinker with things to deal with it. That is one of the, not an absolute litmus test, but it is an indicator. And indeed, you can have perfectly fine videos that don't actually post the papers directly. But it is a thing that found is one of the good indicators that you at least have the potential that you're dealing with somebody who is serious. Now, you can have a creationist that will be posting links to their stuff, and sometimes quite a lot of links. But if all they're doing is posting stuff to their own apologetics, it's not helping you any. No, what I'm talking about are materials you like India and U.S. relations. They are dicey precisely because I have some problems with Modi in terms of that Hindu nationalism thing. And the issues about some of the policies may be perfectly fine. He certainly wants India to be a strong economic power with over 1 billion people there. They can certainly have that impact. It's an indicator of how the world is changing, that about a third of India's population, 330 million, 350, something like that I've heard so far, live functionally middle-class lifestyles that would be comparable to what we would find as the average middle-class lifestyle in the United States. The fact is, of course, they also have an enormous number of very poor people, and then you've also got some wealthy upper part. India, of course, has had to maneuver its own way because they're a neighbor to China, and they've got economic growth issues and potential climate issues. They've got neighbors next door who have nuclear weapons, like Pakistan, and India has nuclear weapons, and so and they've been in occasional war with one another over the years. They're also the largest democracy on the planet, with all their little bumps and grinds. They've had various of their leaders assassinated, and there's been ups and downs and ins and outs. And yet, they've so far managed to still kind of clunk along and keep to a democratic ideal in there. To what extent the Modi style of Hindu nationalism will be a passing fancy, or whether it's a permanent feature of their political landscape. I'm not well enough informed about their culture to be able to say one way or the other. I would say, as a secular humanist sort, that anybody that's trying to distort history for political agendas in the long term isn't serving their own people, let alone the planet. Let's see, what kind of Hindu policies? Well, the Hindu nationalism part certainly is bumped into the matter of historical revisionism. And there's a whole mythological structure about where they think the Hindu culture came from and how far back it dates. And this has impacted how they deal with what we would be talking as kind of Graham Hancock style pseudoscience kind of stuff. And again, I'll be alluding to it in the new book. You get the same kind of thing in Turkey, where little blocks of people are wanting to turn Mount Ararat into a theme park to bring various Christian creationists hunting around for Noah's Ark in there to make money. And there's a certain, in the same way that Loch Ness has fed off of the Loch Ness monster mythology, and Ogopogo, Lake Champlain up in Canada. There's a whole slew of locations that have done this sort of thing. And you for a local tourism, I mean, I can't fault them on that. But I would say that any to the extent that a religion is being favored, and you have the difficulty that the whole Hindu nationalism idea is not egalitarian in the sense that it's particularly tolerant of non-Hindus, just in the same sense that when the Buddhists get in charge, as they are in Myanmar, formerly Burma, they can be just as oppressive and annoying as any other religious structure. So I disapprove of that from a philosophical point of view and from a practical point of view, because the idea that human progress is ever facilitated by trying to ram people through a cookie cutter format as to what you're supposed to believe dictated from on high. Yeah, that doesn't work. So keep an eye on the superstructure. I wish India well in terms of its development of things, just in terms of the sheer number of people they have, how well they fare in the coming bumpy economic times. We will be seeing one way or the other. But do I overall put a thumbs up to Modi? No. I'm leery of him in the same way I am of Erdogan or Orban in Hungary, or if the new right-winger wins in Romania, that fellow. None of these people, or the Le Pen branch of right-wing extremism in French politics, any of these areas, as well as Donald Trump here, who I am clearly not a fan of, as anybody who has been following me on the show will be aware of for quite a long time. Love teleporting plesiosaurs who can live in both fresh and salt water. Yes. Yeah. Well, one of the things that actually kind of undermines the whole idea of any big critters in Loch Ness has to do with the dynamics of the fish population in the area. That any large predator of this type, and you would have to have a population of them, unless you have an extreme longevity plesiosaur, is the fact that there's just not enough stuff in the lake to sustain them. And so the whole subculture of how people have come to think that there are plesiosaurs flipping around inside of Loch Ness is an absolutely fascinating sociological phenomenon, in the same way that you've got the subcultures that believe in Bigfoot. Those things all kind of coalesce into that whole cryptozoology frame, and cryptozoology then intersects with young earth creationism, because a lot of them are perfectly happy to have living dinosaurs and the like, because that fits in with their young earth creationism. So that's why Makele Membi, or whatever the hell it's called down in Africa, pops up, and pterosaurs and others. Will be covering all of that in hilarious, grisly detail in volume 2 of Rocks We're There, to get everybody up to speed on that stuff. It's the whole bit of that whole subculture that really wants there to be surviving prehistoric critters, not because they're fascinated with the survival of critters. Ye gods, any biologist worth their salt would be thrilled to death if there were living pterosaurs or dinosaurs. Wow, that would be absolutely delightful, the scientific discovery of all time. But These people want it because it will reinforce their notion that the Earth is young, and therefore it's not a problem for a pterosaur to have survived the 4,500 years since the flood. They cannot be just one breeding pair for them to be still living. They require a whole population. Exactly so. And there would be so many other factors that would be popping into the thing, So and it pops up to this in a sidebar in relation to coelacanths that turned out to have not gone extinct in the Mesozoic and are still remnant populations of them, Latimeria, are still slogging along in the Indian Ocean. And it's not amazing that such things happen, because particularly if you're a generalist, as the coelacanths that have survived are, it means you're really good. You got a good game going. You can eat practically anything. You live in a relatively quiet environment, and you can manage to muddle along that way. That's pretty much true for almost all of the very, very rare examples of these living fossil things. We alluded to that somewhat in volume 1, and of course it'll be coming up again because we've got some new material. In fact, I just added a brand new paper where the surviving Latimeria coelacanths are providing really relevant information about the development of musculature in the whole fish lineages and how the different things are shifting back and forth. And the fact that we have this living fossil example to give us kind of a snapshot of earlier systems, but you can see the living biology of it because they're still surviving animals, is really useful. First time divers found a coelacanth in the wild. Oh, what? Well, I had understood that they actually had maybe they were only finding previous ones, but I seem to recall having seen documentaries on coelacanths where they were actually showing live ones in the water. But at any rate, maybe those divers just found it. But I seem to think that there had been this some because they're not exactly impossible to see. I think they've been a little easier to find, frankly, than the giant squid that lives in such an awkward environment and flits around so surreptitiously that, apart from finding its remains inside of the stomachs of predatory sperm whales, they're very, very difficult to locate. Anyway, that was a little sidebar on there. But I'll remind you again, seek out Zach Hancock and subscribe to his channel. He's absolutely well worth it. And the fact that they put up the technical information and bring up all these things. He did a fabulous paper with Dan Stern Cardinale recently, criticizing Carter and the people trying to find created heterozygosity and genetic entropy stuff. And so if you ever want the technical argument about why genetic entropy is claptrap, Dan Stern Cardinale and Zach Hancock can bore the tears off you going into all the reasons why that's so. Oh, I see. Yes. There would have been robot subs. And this was the first time some actual human being managed to get down there. Yeah, that sounds very plausible. Okay, so we're about half hour in. Let me put my little bit to remind everybody that I am not unmindful of the fact that there are actually some Patreon people who are helping the old RJ muddle along every month, which, given the circumstance of things, I am most grateful for. I do have my Social Security, which at least I didn't worry about the approach from. I understand there are quite a few people who get their checks still by mail and that are nincompoops in the Trump administration. We're actually slowing some of that down. Bad dog for people. The Lutnick was saying, well, really, my mother wouldn't bother if she missed a check. Well, you're a billionaire, so I suppose you wouldn't let your mother get into trouble. But for those of us who aren't billionaires, it makes a big difference. So I've had direct deposit on my Social Security check for quite a few years, and so that means it goes instantly into my bank account, and that at least has not been interrupted by the nincompoops currently running the Trump administration. Although, isn't that kind of redundant? Being in the Trump administration is prima facie evidence that you're a nincompoop, because anybody with any spine or conscience can't deal with it. And it certainly will corrode what is left of any integrity from poor Marco Rubio, who's now had to take on more jobs yet because they've shunted the nincompoop over into, or may or may not end up over in as ambassador to the UN. About the plan to cut Section 8, without that, I'd be living in a van. Yeah, there's so many different areas. The one so far bright side has to do with the fact that it's lawsuits up the yin yang. That, and by and large, the courts have not been bending over backwards in support of Donald Trump, including all the way up to the Supreme. I think even some of the ideologues on the court aren't quite nutty enough to think that the president is independent. He can simply decree things. The other fascinating thing about how I've been bragging about how fantastic and incredible and wonderful their 100 days has been. This is unlike the Roosevelt administration, where they were actually passing legislation in that 100 days because the Congress had already turned into a Democrat by 1932. The big 30 election had swung that way. They would eventually take the Senate too in 32. So by the time he becomes president of the United States, they've got the chance to put through legislative things. So far, Trump 2.0 has done diddly squat in the legislative department, which means it's all his executive orders, which means that's removable by the next administration. It's not exactly permanent, many of which will be challenged as unconstitutional and the like. I know he'd love to be able to simply sequester funds the way Nixon wanted to do, and Clinton to some extent tried to do that too. And the Supreme Court all slammed them down as, nope, can't do that. So I don't see any chance that the Trump administration would pull that. Yeah, back from El Salvador. Yeah, exactly. And that's the other area where this turns into potential constitutional crisis. Because when the Supreme Court tells you to do something and you don't do it, they don't have an army. Are they in the spot of saying to Andrew Jackson, you can't expel people, Cherokee and all that? And so, well, the court's made its ruling, let them try to enforce it. If we're at that stage, then that's murky indeed. But two can play that game. What is the president of the United States? He's just a person. What if you give us a command and the people down the line just say, no, we're not going to do it? What are you going to do? And if you've got enough people doing that, it's a crisis in terms of upsetting the apple cart in the way that the government runs or not. But the idea that the president can just brazen on through and count on everybody going, Jawohl, mein Kommandant, no matter what he does, is not a blank check. It will corrode the authority of the presidency after him. In fact, we may see that because of Trump, the imperial president was going to be run through a shredder. And if we undergo some transformations due to the Depression, to where we reconfigure, and I'd like to see us go back to a circumstance where presidents can't do war thingies unless they actually have a declaration of war from bloody Congress. And that means that so many of the powers that have been delegated to the presidency because of fecklessness and cowardice on the part of Congress, they're going to have to actually earn their pay. I can easily see an awful lot of people who would be perfectly fine to see that happen, from Ocasio-Cortez and Katie Porter and Elizabeth Warren. There's certainly no shortage of people who are perfectly willing to step up and say, here's what we need to do, and this is why it should be done. And we'll see what's happening. So anyway, this is going to be an interesting little period, as I've been warning for quite some time. Working hard to place the heads of agencies, including the Pentagon. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is all Project 25 up the yin yang, and plus, we don't want anybody who says no. There is a double whammy problem here. For one thing, because they've been gutting people in so many administrations, bureaucracies don't run on autopilot. And if you don't have people in these middle-level positions, things don't happen. And the idea that somebody can just simply decree things happen and not have anybody downstream, to think that Hegseth, moving from having commanded a platoon at one point and now spending years and years and years playing buffoon on Fox News, and then he suddenly is running a $1 trillion operation that requires micromanaging at every level. I'd be surprised if he hasn't hit the bottle again by the time he's into this area, assuming he isn't thrown out as a revolving door in Trump 1.0. But to some extent, the incompetence and arrogance of these moves will be self-defeating, in that they're not going to be able to pull off some of the things they will. They will be able to screw up an awful lot of people's lives. Look at the people who have been expelled already, people who have been fired from their positions. They're going to, but a lot of these things I think won't be able to get very far. The fellow that was in the FBI that got axed because of the fact that he dared to say correctly that Mr. Trump lost the 2020 election, and now he's going to be persecuted and hauled up on charges. At least that's the plan of Patel and Bundy. I would be flabbergasted if any of that can make it through a grand jury, let alone into a conviction. And so, as we've seen already, the clown car of legal maneuvers aren't necessarily going anywhere. The legal teams that caved briefly to Trump under intimidation may have regretted having done that, because the ones that haven't caved have gone to court and they've won. And like any bully, you got to stand up to it. Oh yeah, well, one of the great saving graces of Trump is that he and the people around him are monumentally incompetent. They do not know what they're doing. I don't know how many are old enough to remember the old Peter Principle idea. This was a thing that was making around in the public media back in the 1970s. The idea that in any bureaucracy, people have a tendency to get promoted to a point above their level of competence, and that some of the inefficiencies and eccentricities of bureaucratic systems have come about because of that. Well, you've got a positive glut of Peter Principle people who are operating in spots way above their level of competence, or people who had no competence at all. So whatever position they're in, they're going to be incompetent at it. All of these people that he's put into, Kash Patel and others, these people had no business being in such positions of power. And they're going to make life miserable to some extent for some people. And they may be able to intimidate some people for a while and interrupt stuff for a while. But the number of lawsuits that are going to be colliding with all of these people afterwards, you see, an awful lot of those people are not immune from prosecution in the way the president has been granted immunity by the Trump Supreme Court. And so even though Trump won't necessarily see any problems for him personally, this doesn't mean that all the rest of the people are going to be facing exactly that. And of course, Trump is facing a far more dire consequence, because I think all the signs are there that he is in fact suffering from dementia, and that it's only going to get worse over time as his sentences start rambling more and more, and it's harder and harder for him to go anything. Instead, he suddenly runs off on tropes, Russia, 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 and so forth, as well as mispronouncing things and confusion. He's several times tried to walk out of the room before signing an executive order, and they've literally had to pull him back in to sign the bloody thing. Terrible, terrible. Now, the irony about the whole issue about what's happening with Putin, for one thing, I think with that little chat that Zelensky had at the Pope's funeral, Zelensky's figured out how to play Trump. This doesn't mean that he can have a blank check, but he's figured out what he needs to do to flatter him. And various leaders have had to learn how to do this, that they have to just hold their tongue, figure out what they need to do to make the little child, the man baby Trump, more pliable to get what they want. All he needs to do is stall enough so that Trump doesn't pull the plug too much on aid to Ukraine, because Europe is really stepping up. Germany and Sweden and Denmark and the whole array of people in NATO and the European Union are really swinging into position to supply them with very sophisticated weaponry, and they're upping their defense budgets and doing all sorts of things that are going to make Europe much stronger. And it won't matter that Trump is screaming bloody murder, that they're not spending their own way in NATO. They might reach the point where they'll just say, goodbye, we'll jettison the United States from NATO and do it our own way. France, Macron has literally offered the French nuclear umbrella as a replacement for the United States. I mean, and in the real world, you don't need many nuclear bombs to go off for that to be a deterrent. So the fact that you don't have as many as the United States does for weapons that nobody can use, okay, my 5 is weapons that we can't use is just as useful as having 100 weapons that you can't use. Oh, if we get rid of Trump, will things be any better? Under oh hell no. That's the reason why I'm not all that impressed with that option. Whoops. There we go. Jump up there. Whoop. There we go. Yes, any better. J.D. Vance is a true believer. He's a kind of a Catholic extremist um, oddball that actually does believe in some philosophies. And of course, he's got his little puppet master, Teal, behind him, part of those little oligarch investment banker types. And so he's a scary character as well. Um, whether or not he tries to pull a coup somewhere down the road and get Trump removed under the 25th Amendment and what kind of ramifications that will have for infighting within the Trump camp, only time will tell. So there we go. So signing the agreement with Ukraine means Trump now has to pretend to be friends with both Zelensky and Putin. The thing that is probably going to be most galling for Trump is that I think the situation has moved to the point where Zelensky and European allies of Zelensky don't care what Trump does on this. That what agreement he might try to make with Putin is irrelevant if Zelensky and the Europeans will say no. And there's every reason to think that Putin is in much more dire straits than I think either Trump or Vance think he is. Vance and Trump are often just simply parroting the party line about how formidable the Russians are, but all of the military analysis that I've been seeing coming out of the area indicate that, wow, Putin is a paper tiger, that this stuff, he can be a nuisance. They've got a lot of drones and missiles that they can fire, but they're getting low on ammunition. Their tanks have been decimated. They're to the point of where they're sucking off the North Koreans for assistance, and they're not doing all that well. Whether or not the Chinese will be looking at them in due course, especially in the economic crisis that can be coming, which will be impacting China because we're their biggest trading partner. And the Russians may just sink like the Titanic into the mire because they simply can't afford to move much on. And it means that they won't be providing much in the way of reparations aid to Ukraine. They'll have to rebuild that, but I think they'll manage to maneuver around that. So it's going to be an interesting 4, 5, 6 years to see what's happening. I think Asian's still an atheist like Trump, but pretending. Well, it's really hard to say that about him. He apparently did seem suffering kind of a religious conversion, falling into that. Something funny happened in all the budget, but best for the last 40 years. Yes. This, if you want to see the Trump administration on, just look at the oligarch world of Putin's Russia, and whether or not a failing war that turned into a meat grinder got rid of the czars because of that. Putin, the idea that a dictator is invulnerable, cue Saddam Hussein, cue Gaddafi, cue Ceausescu in Romania, not necessarily permanent. Vance won't be able to get away with the shit Dump has. Well, it's hard to tell with him. At any rate, I do not want to see him as president. We at least have a oddly incompetent blunderer who flits back and forth on silly things. Vance would certainly be more diligent in these things and would seem to be more personable and normal than Trump, which could actually make it harder to be able to slow him down. So I don't know. It's a tough little world we live in. It's going to be a ways to go through the roller coaster that we're going to be into through to 26 and 30 and 28. Whether or not we have more pandemics, now that we got RFK Jr. in there, these things are not impossible. Bird flu, measles outbreaks, polio outbreaks. There's so many different dynamics that can be going on. And if, for example, another pandemic were going on in 2028, that means you postpone the Los Angeles Olympics. So Trump may not even get a chance to go there, even though if it's like the 32 Olympics were, Hoover didn't attend the 32 Olympics either. So, oh, well, both in Los Angeles, by the way. Los Angeles may have the ill timing of managing to do 2 Olympic Games, both of them during depressions. So, exciting. Anyway, there's our jaunt down memory lane. Let me put my little advert up for our book. Whoops, I keep on going to my mouse, saying that's not attached to the laptop. Come. There we go. And get our little window up to speed. And we will let that run for the time it takes to run. So everybody stay safe, regardless of where you are, under what circumstance. If be mindful of the fact that if economic times get really dumpy, Trumpy, make sure your cash flow and things are smooth, and be mindful of the fact that agricultural food supplies to grocery stores and all sorts of little cross affairs. It depends on where you're living and what kind of employer base you've got and all this kind of stuff. It's going to be an interesting thing. If you're living in a blue state, you're probably going to be in a better spot than if you are in a sink or swim, crash and burn red state. So it's going to be an interesting few years to see what's going on. And we'll be into stuff, and I'll be probably railing on more about the antics of the Trump administration as we follow through. Next week there will be another installment of the Luskin Files. I've been really having great fun slogging along through that and finding the non-smoking gun. It is an indication that how diligent they are in being able to marshal so many technical papers that do not support their primary argument. It is most exciting. So officials in Trump's administration are stocking toilet paper. Yes, I have heard about that little aspect of it. We're going to be in an interesting triage level as it becomes increasingly obvious that things are not going well for Trump. But then again, there's this insularity of the Trump inner circle. I mean, all you had to do was to look at his cabinet meeting, and all of these ass kissers saying how fantastic and wonderful and incredible they are and how honored they are to be in the best administration ever, in the best 100 days ever. Well, when you're Trump, who moves from one apartment to the elevator to the private plane to the other elevator to the private plane, etc., and he's been doing this for years and watches only a small network thing, primarily Fox Trump Pravda, all he's getting is reinforcement of the things he wants to be true. Nobody ever says, but no. And now he's got an environment where he thinks everything is well. He thinks the economy is just going swell. He thinks the price of eggs have gone down. And he has decreed things have happened, and so they must have happened. So it's getting to the point where even without demand, there would be just an information bubble as bad as Hitler in the Führer bunker, where he's moving around imaginary divisions, even as the bombs are falling overhead and the Russians are coming closer with their tanks. That when you try to build a worldview based upon inaccurate information, and nobody is there to tell you truth to power, and Trump has made sure he's surrounded by people who will never do that, it can't avoid going wrong. The problem can come if we have some international crises that actually involve the Defense Department. It can be murky indeed as to where these things can go. So if we can get by with our Reputation intact without any disastrous military misadventures. That will be great lucky. We'll see what happens. I'm in terms of trying to work out what the replay is on the Great Depression, World War II scenario. The dynamics are not the same as they were in the 1930s. You have the European Union that didn't exist then. You have a network of communication and industrialization in a lot of what used to be the colonial countries. There is no conventional colonial power network where France and England and others had colonial operations. You've got players that are technologically sophisticated and therefore able to adopt strategies that would not have been really feasible back in the 1930s. So if we can manage to squeak through this without a global depression, that lowers the prospect that we'd be getting involved in any serious World War II kind of scenario, which was certainly accelerated by the fact that everybody was having the wrong economic policies during that critical period prior to 39. So anyway, starting to fall off, but his MAGA base has not changed. Oh, yeah. Well, you have to remember the core MAGA base are your classic Tony Perkins extremist creationists. And just as they do not change their mind on how old the earth is, they will never change their mind on how their God King Emperor is operating. But that doesn't mean that you still don't have a huge block of people. Remember, Trump got like 65 million votes in 2016 and 77 million in 2024. We can assume that a big chunk of that 65 million are the true believers, but that means that there's 10, 15, 20, 30 million within that boundary layer that may never quite become non-Tortucan, but they can certainly pay attention to their internal reality. And if they are out of work or they're just like there was just a report on 60 Minutes about the West Virginia coal miners who are seeing all of the federal aid to their black lung response system being gutted by the Doge idiots. And it's not looking all that clear that Trump is going to reinstate any of that stuff. And that means you're going to have governors and senators and others who are Republicans in West Virginia, plus a whole lot of wheezy coal miners and their families and friends and neighbors in their communities who voted for Trump and seeing that they are being screwed royally. That acts as a 2x4 across the collective face as to whether they need to rethink some of their political affiliation. So, do you have a frost advisory? Oh, not in Spokane. We had a little bit of light rain today, and we should be moving into the 70s and 80s over the next week, which is an average and a little bit more for temperatures in this area. We had a relatively mild winter. I know this by my direct experience because I shovel with them because I don't have a snow thrower. One of these days, I will be able to afford, maybe, cross fingers, more patrons, eventually get one of the electric snow throwers, but they're still kind of pricey at the moment. Battery electric snow throwers. That's anything with a cord is a waste of time. I have a battery electric mower that is just easy peasy to work. And the snow throwers typically are designed where they have double batteries to be able to, because you have a hell of a lot of torque that you need to be able to do a snow thrower compared to a lawnmower. But the prices were running in the 6, 7, 8, 900 plus range, which was where electric mowers were 5-10 years ago. So we'll see how things work on that. So anyway, everybody stay safe, watch out for the wooden penguins, and we will all see you kids next week. Signing off for the week.